My dad tried to shame me in court, shouting she's a disgrace, until the judge abruptly halted the hearing and asked, "Hold on. You honestly have no idea?" His lawyer looked like he'd seen a ghost, my dad turned pale, and the whole courtroom knew this case was about to spiral out of control. Have you ever had a moment so gut-wrenching, so utterly shocking, that it rips your entire life, your very identity, right out from under you? A moment where the person you thought you knew, the foundation you built everything on, suddenly becomes a stranger? Because for Elena Hartley, that moment came in a courtroom, with 5 simple words from a judge that shattered her world, and yet, in the most twisted way possible, set her free. This isn't just some dramatic story about a custody battle or a family torn apart by pride. This is about secrets that fester for generations, lies told to protect, and lies told to destroy. It's about the earth-shattering power of truth when it finally steps out of the shadows, and how it can completely redefine who you are. I'm talking about the day Elena, a young mom, went to court fighting her own father for her daughter's future. And instead, she found herself sitting there while that same man learned a devastating truth he'd been lied to his entire life. The judge, with a bewildered look on her face, asked him, "Wait, you seriously don't know?" Those 5 words, man. They just echoed through that courtroom, freezing everyone in place. Faces went pale. Attorneys dropped their pens. Even the bailiffs leaned forward in disbelief. It was the kind of moment that makes you gasp, that makes you wonder, what the hell just happened? And trust me, what happened next was even wilder. See, Elena Hartley was just 26 years old when she walked into the family courthouse on a cold Tuesday morning. Her hands were trembling, clutched around a folder filled with every scrap of proof she had that she was a good mother. She'd been up since 4 a.m., staring at her apartment ceiling, while her sweet 4-year-old, Sophie, slept soundly next door. Elena had tried so hard to look responsible. Navy dress, neat bun, just enough makeup to hide the exhaustion from weeks of sleepless nights and gnawing worry. But when she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the weary woman staring back. This wasn't the life she'd dreamed of, not when she was her father's golden child, before everything fell apart. She wanted to be a teacher, to have a stable life, to make her family proud. Instead, she was a single mom, recently laid off, fighting her own father for her child. Her father, Richard Hartley, was everything Elena wasn't: powerful, wealthy, connected. He owned Hartley Development Corporation, a real estate empire. He golfed with city council members, donated to campaigns, and appeared in society pages with his perfectly coiffed, perpetually smiling second wife, Diane. Richard valued control above all else. Success meant power, influence. He expected Elena to follow the path he laid out, no questions asked. And for a long time, she tried. She got straight A's, joined debate, picked the colleges he approved of, even studied business administration because he said teaching was for people who couldn't do anything else. She dated the rich, promising young men he introduced her to. But everything changed when Elena was 22, in her final year of college. She met Marcus Chen at a coffee shop. He was 25, working 2 jobs, taking night classes for graphic design. He had a smile that made Elena feel like she could finally breathe. Marcus didn't care about her father's name or money. He didn't ask what she could do for his career. He asked what she wanted, what made her happy, what dreams she had buried under other people's expectations. For 6 months, Elena lived a double life. Secret dates with Marcus, perfect daughter facade for her father. She kept telling herself she'd tell him when the timing was right, after graduation, when she found the courage. Then, she got pregnant. 8 weeks along. She finally told Marcus, terrified. But he surprised her, holding her hands, saying they'd figure it out. He wanted to be a father. They could make it work. 2 weeks later, Marcus was gone. A note. Sorry. Panicked. Not ready, she never saw him again. He'd moved, changed his number, just vanished. She was alone. Pregnant. Absolutely terrified. Telling her father? That was the hardest thing she'd ever done. She found him in his study after dinner one Sunday, reviewing contracts. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she knocked on that heavy oak door. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Elena stood there, surrounded by leather-bound books and awards, and she told him. She was pregnant. The silence that followed was deafening, stretched out for what felt like hours. He slowly put down his pen, leaned back, and stared at her with an expression she'd never seen, a mix of disgust and cold fury. He asked about the father. When Elena told him about Marcus, about his background, about him leaving, her father's face turned scarlet. He stood up and laid out her two choices: abortion, never speak of this again, life as planned. Or, keep the baby, and be completely cut off. No money, no family name, no help. He told her she was throwing away everything he'd built for her, being selfish and stupid. No daughter of mine will be a single mother with some nobody's child who ran away, he roared. Elena just stood there, listening to him list all the ways she'd disappointed him, all the opportunities she was destroying, the shame she'd bring to his name. And something inside her snapped. She looked at this man who'd controlled her entire life, who never once asked what she wanted, and was now demanding she end her pregnancy for his reputation. She said no. She told him she was keeping her baby, that she'd do it without his help, without his money, without his name, without his approval. Her father just stared, then told her to get out and never come back. That night, Elena packed a bag, moved in with her best friend Rachel, and never returned. The next 4 years were the hardest of Elena's life, but also the most meaningful. Sophie was born 3 days after Elena's 23rd birthday. Tiny, perfect, with dark eyes and a grip that felt impossibly strong. Rachel let them stay in her spare room for free while Elena worked part-time, saving up for her own place. She found a small, one-bedroom apartment in a safe but not fancy neighborhood. She worked full-time, took extra shifts, skipped meals so Sophie would always have enough. Every night, she fell into bed exhausted, but every morning, Sophie's smile made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was doing okay. Her father? She never heard a word. It was like she'd ceased to exist for him the moment she walked out of his study. Elena told herself she didn't care, that she was better off without him. But sometimes, late at night, when the bills were piling up and she was utterly drained, she wished she had someone to call, someone to lean on. To not feel so completely alone. Then, 3 months ago, everything imploded. Elena was laid off. Budget cuts. She frantically searched for new work, sending out dozens of resumes. But the job market was brutal, and with a 4-year-old, she needed specific hours, couldn't afford expensive childcare for nights or weekends. She fell behind on rent, moved to an even smaller, cheaper apartment. Bought discount groceries. Skipped more meals so Sophie would eat. She was drowning, and she was terrified. That's when her father showed up. Elena had just gotten home from another failed interview when she heard a knock. Richard Hartley stood in the hallway, looking completely out of place in his expensive suit against the peeling paint of her building. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked past her, into her tiny apartment, looking around with thinly veiled disgust. He said they needed to talk. Elena, frozen, eventually closed the door and asked what he wanted. He turned to her. He'd heard she was struggling, he said. He'd kept tabs. He couldn't stand by and watch his granddaughter grow up in poverty when he had the means to help. He offered to let her back into the family, provide financial support, give her a job at his company. All she had to do was agree to his terms. A flicker of desperate, fragile hope sparked in Elena. "What terms?" she asked. Her father smiled, but it wasn't kind. She would move into a property he owned. Nothing fancy, but better than this. He would manage her finances. He would provide childcare through a service he approved. She would work at his company, in whatever position he assigned. And she would not make any major decisions regarding Sophie without consulting him first. Elena listened, and that fragile hope evaporated. This wasn't help. This was control. This was her father offering to save her, but only if she gave him complete power over her life and Sophie's. She looked at him. What if I refuse? His expression hardened. If she refused, he would be forced to take more serious action. He couldn't stand by and watch Sophie suffer because of her pride and poor judgment. He would do whatever was necessary to protect Sophie, even if that meant protecting her from her own mother. Get out! Elena's voice shook with anger and fear. He left without another word. 2 weeks later, the legal papers arrived. Richard Hartley was filing for emergency custody of Sophie, claiming Elena was mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, unable to provide a safe home. The petition was 23 pages of knives. It detailed her job loss, her apartment moves, her limited income, her reliance on friends for childcare. It described her as erratic, emotional, prone to poor decision-making. It even included affidavits from people Elena had never met, claiming she yelled at Sophie, left her with unsafe caregivers, neglected her needs. Every single claim was either a blatant lie or a twisted version of reality, designed to paint Elena as the worst parent imaginable. The yelling at Sophie incident? Sophie had run toward a busy street, and Elena had screamed her name in pure panic, then hugged her, crying with relief. The unsafe caregiver? Rachel, her best friend of 15 years, a registered nurse. Neglect? Buying store-brand groceries because that's what she could afford. But on paper, in cold legal language by an expensive attorney, it sounded horrifying. Elena read it 3 times, then collapsed on her bathroom floor, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. She thought about calling her father, begging him to stop, agreeing to anything. But she knew it wouldn't end. If she gave in now, she'd never be free. He'd control her forever. Sophie would grow up watching her mother diminished and directed like a child. So instead, Elena called every attorney in the phone book until she found one willing to take her case, despite her almost non-existent funds. Maria Chen, a woman in her 40s, a fierce family law attorney. Maria listened to Elena's story, looked at the petition, and told her bluntly, "This is going to be ugly. Richard Hartley has money and connections. But you have the truth. And I'll make sure that truth comes out." The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of depositions, documents, and constant anxiety. Elena felt like she was living a nightmare. She spent hours with Maria, proving her dedication as a mother, debunking every false claim. Maria kept saying they had a solid case, that the judge would see through the manipulation. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling, her father always found a way to win. The night before the hearing, Elena sat on Sophie's bed, watching her sleep. This tiny person who trusted her completely, who had no idea that tomorrow a judge would decide if they got to stay together. Elena whispered promises into the darkness, *, I'll fight for you. I won't let anyone take you away. We'll be okay, *, she didn't sleep a wink. Couldn't eat breakfast. Barely remembered the drive. But she remembered walking through those courthouse doors. The smell of old wood, the echo of footsteps, the heavy folder in her hands, her whole life as a mother. She remembered sitting on the hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4B, hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white, waiting for her father. He arrived 30 minutes late, completely unapologetic. Tall, commanding, perfectly styled silver hair, that familiar look of irritation and superiority. Behind him, Gerald Fitzpatrick, a ruthless attorney known for twisting facts and destroying opponents. Fitzpatrick, who sent those 23 pages of lies. Richard didn't even acknowledge Elena as he walked past, treating her like she was invisible. Maria squeezed Elena's shoulder, whispering, "Stay calm. Don't react. The judge will see him for who he is." Then, the bailiff opened the door. "All rise." Judge Evelyn Reeves entered. Late 50s, sharp eyes behind frameless glasses. Known for being fair but stern, no nonsense. Elena prayed that reputation was true. Fitzpatrick started his opening statement, smooth, confident, rehearsed. Richard Hartley, a concerned grandfather, heartbroken by his daughter's poor choices, her rejection of family support out of pride. Elena, unstable, unable to provide a safe environment. He presented the evidence, the job loss, the housing, the struggles. The only responsible action, he argued, was to grant Richard temporary custody. For 10 minutes, Elena listened as she was painted a failure, irresponsible, unfit. When he sat down, she wanted to scream, to tell everyone it was all lies. But Maria told her to trust the process. So, she stayed silent, digging her nails into her palms. Then it was Maria's turn. Calm, but firm. She explained this petition wasn't about welfare, it was a punitive action by a controlling father against a daughter who refused to submit to his demands. She outlined the timeline. Richard hadn't been involved in Sophie's life for 4 years, not until Elena refused his conditional help. Every claim was false or exaggerated. Maria spoke of Elena's dedication, her sacrifices, her love. She reminded the judge that being poor is not being unfit. Struggling is not failing. Every parent deserves the chance to fight for their child without being judged by the standards of someone with wealth and privilege. A tiny flicker of hope, easily crushed. Judge Reeves reviewed the documents. Then, she asked Fitzpatrick to call Richard Hartley to the stand. Elena watched her father walk to the front, place his hand on the Bible, and swear to tell the truth. The irony was almost painful. Richard sat, dignified, composed. Fitzpatrick asked questions designed to show a man who cared deeply, heartbroken by his daughter's choices. Richard answered smoothly, describing his attempts to help, his offers of financial support, his deep disappointment when Elena rejected everything out of stubborn pride. He talked about Sophie growing up in poverty, worrying for her safety, feeling he had no choice but to take legal action. He sounded so reasonable, so concerned, even sad. He sounded like a good man. Elena felt rage building in her chest, hot and suffocating. She knew he was lying. When Fitzpatrick finished, Judge Reeves told Maria she could cross-examine. Maria stood, determination in her eyes. She asked Richard to describe his offers in detail. When he gave vague generalities, she pushed for specifics, dates, times, communication methods. He couldn't provide them. So Maria pulled out her phone. She started reading. Text messages from Richard to Elena. Not offers of help, but threats. Insults. Voicemails where he called his daughter worthless and stupid. Emails outlining his demands for total control in exchange for any support. With every piece of evidence, his facade cracked. He tried to explain them away, out of context, twisting my words. But the evidence spoke for itself. This wasn't a concerned grandfather. This was a man trying to punish and control. Judge Reeves listened, her expression unreadable. When Maria finished, the judge leaned forward. Mr. Hartley, she said directly, is this petition truly motivated by concern for Sophie's welfare, or by anger at your daughter for not obeying you? Elena held her breath. Richard just sat there for a moment, jaw tight, gripping the arms of the chair. Then, something in him snapped. He stood up, face flushing red with rage. He pointed directly at Elena. She's an embarrassment, he shouted. Always has been. She ruined her life getting pregnant by some nobody who ran away. She rejected every opportunity one gave her. She's raising his granddaughter in squalor because she's too proud and too stupid to accept help. She's a disgrace to my name. Sophie deserves better than a mother who can't even keep a job or a stable home. His voice echoed through the courtroom, filled with years of resentment. Elena felt every word like a physical blow. The courtroom went utterly silent. The stenographer froze. Bailiffs stared. Fitzpatrick looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Maria sat perfectly still. Judge Reeves slowly removed her glasses, leaned back, and stared at Richard with an unreadable expression. Then, she did something completely unexpected. She closed the file, set her glasses down, and in a dangerously calm voice, she asked Richard Hartley if he was finished. When he sat back down, still breathing hard, she asked him one simple question. Do you know why Elena's pregnancy felt like such a scandal for you? Why it felt like such a betrayal? Richard looked utterly confused. It's obvious. My daughter got pregnant out of wedlock by someone unsuitable. It embarrassed me, damaged my reputation. Judge Reeves nodded slowly. Then she asked another question that made no sense to anyone. Mr. Hartley, she said, have you ever wondered why your daughter looks nothing like you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard stared, clearly having no idea what she was talking about. Judge Reeves leaned forward, her expression now openly surprised, and she spoke those 5 words that would change everything. Wait, you seriously don't know? Richard demanded, what do you mean, his voice sharp with irritation. Judge Reeves looked at him, then at Elena, then back at Richard. She explained that before becoming a judge, she'd practiced family law for 20 years. And during that time, she'd handled a very specific, very complicated case involving Richard Hartley's first wife, Catherine Hartley. A divorce, 27 years ago. She remembered it because it involved unusual circumstances, including the fact that Catherine had been pregnant at the time and had included specific clauses in the settlement regarding paternity and child support. Richard Hartley went completely still, his face draining of color. Elena felt the room spin. The judge continued. Catherine Hartley had disclosed during those proceedings that her daughter, the child she was pregnant with, was not biologically Richard Hartley's. The biological father was a man Catherine had been involved with during a brief separation from Richard. A man named Marcus Chin. The name hit Elena like a freight train. Marcus Chin. Her father. The man who had gotten her pregnant, the man who had disappeared. Judge Reeves was still talking. Catherine had insisted on including the paternity information in the sealed divorce records, in case it ever became relevant. Richard Hartley had agreed to raise the child as his own, and to never reveal the truth about her paternity. The judge paused, looked at Richard. Do you remember any of this, Mr. Hartley? Do you remember agreeing to keep this secret? Do you remember that the daughter you just called an embarrassment in open court is not actually your biological child? Richard Hartley sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His attorney, Fitzpatrick, was frantically flipping through files, searching for anything that would explain this. Maria sat beside Elena, her hand reaching out, gripping Elena's arm, as if to keep her grounded. Elena couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what she was hearing. Her mother never told her. Her entire life, she'd believed Richard Hartley was her father. Tried to earn his approval. Walked away believing she was rejecting her own blood. But he wasn't her father. He never had been. And Marcus Chin? The man she thought was just her boyfriend, who abandoned her when she got pregnant. He was actually her biological father. The man whose name she had just heard for the second time in her life. Judge Reeves kept speaking, her voice filled with disbelief now. She'd recognized Elena's name when she reviewed the case file. Pulled the sealed divorce records. Confirmed the information. The daughter you spent 26 years controlling and judging and ultimately trying to take a child away from is not your biological daughter. She'd agreed to keep that secret as part of her divorce settlement, and Catherine had apparently never told Elena the truth before she died. Elena's mother had died of cancer when Elena was 16. 10 years ago. And she had taken this secret to her grave. Judge Reeves asked Richard Hartley again, do you remember? Slowly, horribly, recognition dawned on his face. He remembered. He'd buried it so deep, lived the lie so completely, he'd almost convinced himself it wasn't true. But it was true. And now it was out. In a courtroom full of witnesses. There was no taking it back. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Suffocating. Elena sat at her table, her entire world collapsing around her. Richard Hartley was not her father. Marcus Chin was her father. The man who got her pregnant was her biological father, which meant Sophie was not just Richard Hartley's granddaughter. Sophie was the product of something Elena's mind couldn't even fully process yet. Judge Reeves, seeing the enormity of her revelation, immediately called for a recess. Everyone was to remain in the courthouse, 30 minutes. Elena couldn't move, couldn't stand. Her ears were ringing. Maria was pulling her to her feet, guiding her out, into an empty conference room, sitting her down. Elena stared at the wood grain of the table, tried to make her brain work. Maria waited. Finally, Elena looked up. What does this mean, legally, for the custody case? Maria took a deep breath. It changes everything. Richard Hartley had filed for custody as Sophie's grandfather. But if he wasn't Elena's biological father, then he wasn't Sophie's biological grandfather. He had no legal standing to file for custody. More than that. If Marcus Chin was Elena's biological father, and Marcus Chin was also Sophie's biological father, then Sophie was the product of something deeply problematic, potentially illegal. Depending on when Marcus learned Elena was his daughter. Bile rose in Elena's throat. What do you mean? Maria explained gently. If Marcus Chin knew Elena was his biological daughter when he began a relationship with her, that would be a serious crime, incest. If he didn't know, if he had no idea, then it was a horrific coincidence, but not criminal. Either way, it changed everything. Richard Hartley's petition was based on being a concerned grandfather, but he wasn't a grandfather at all. He was a man who had raised a child not his own, kept it secret for 26 years, and was now trying to take custody of a child he had no legal relationship to. Maria said Judge Reeves would almost certainly dismiss the petition outright. No legal basis. But Elena needed to understand, there would be other consequences. Other questions. Other investigations. If Marcus Chin could be found, they'd need to know what he knew, and when. Elena asked the question she most feared. What does this mean for Sophie? Maria's expression softened. She reached across the table, took Elena's hand. Sophie is an innocent child, Elena. None of this is her fault. She will be protected and loved, no matter what. But, Maria added honestly, there would be questions. Social services might get involved. Investigations. Difficult conversations. Elena started to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for Sophie. For the truth about her parentage. For the father she'd spent years trying to please who wasn't even her biological father. For her mother, who had taken this secret to her grave. For Marcus Chin, who might have unknowingly been with his own daughter. When she finally stopped, Maria handed her tissues. We need to go back. Elena stood on shaking legs. The courtroom was already filling. Richard Hartley sat at his table, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. When Elena walked in, he looked at her. Really looked at her. And she saw something she'd never seen before. Not anger. Not disappointment. Horror. And maybe, just maybe, the dawning of understanding that he'd spent 26 years punishing a child for not being his, when she never had been. Judge Reeves returned, looking tired, as if the revelation had taken something out of her too. She spoke in a measured, careful tone. She had reviewed the sealed divorce records. Richard Hartley had acknowledged in writing 27 years ago that Elena was not his biological child, but agreed to raise her as his own and keep it confidential. This fundamentally changed the custody petition. Richard Hartley had no legal standing as a grandparent. Therefore, she was dismissing the custody petition in its entirety. The case was over. Elena sat very still, waiting for relief. It didn't come. Yes, she had one. But at what cost? Her entire identity was a lie. The man she called father wasn't her father. Her real father had unknowingly been with her, then abandoned her when she got pregnant with his grandchild, who was also his child. The enormity of it was too much. Judge Reeves was still speaking, explaining her legal obligation to refer aspects of the case to the authorities for investigation, specifically regarding the relationship between Elena and Marcuston. Elena wasn't under investigation, she was clearly a victim. But legal and ethical questions needed answers. Then, the judge did something unusual. She looked directly at Elena, not as a judge, but as a human being. She apologized for how this information came out. It should never have been revealed in such a public and shocking manner. But sometimes the truth comes out in ways we don't expect or want. She told Elena she had reviewed the evidence, and it was clear Elena was a loving, dedicated mother. Nothing about this revelation changes that fact. She told Elena to take care of herself and Sophie, to seek counseling. To remember she wasn't defined by the circumstances of her birth, or Sophie's. Then, Judge Reeves turned to Richard Hartley. Her tone changed completely. His behavior in court had been appalling. His treatment of his daughter, biological or not, cruel and controlling. She hoped he would spend serious time reflecting on the harm he had caused. She was issuing a restraining order, preventing him from contacting Elena or Sophie for 1 year. During that time, he could seek therapy and potentially work toward reconciliation if Elena was willing. But for now, he was to stay away. Richard didn't respond. He just sat there, broken and small in his expensive suit. Hearing closed. It was over. Elena stood on numb legs. Maria was talking about paperwork, next steps, resources. Elena barely heard. She walked out, pulled out her phone. The first person she called was Rachel. I need you to keep Sophie a few more hours. I'll explain everything later. I just need time. Rachel agreed, asked if Elena was okay. Elena lied. I'm fine. She wasn't fine. She didn't think she would ever be fine again. The days that followed were a blur. Phone calls, meetings, forms, investigations. A social worker came to her apartment. Elena answered every question, showed every document, trying not to break down. The social worker was kind, said Sophie was clearly well cared for and loved. No concerns about Elena's parenting. That was something. Then came the investigator from the DA's office. A detective specializing in family crimes. They wanted to ask about Marcuston. Elena told him everything, the coffee shop, the 6 months, the pregnancy, the disappearance. She gave him Marcus's last known phone number, address, school. The detective listened, took notes. They would find Marcus and determine what he knew, and when. Then he dropped another bombshell. If Marcus had known Elena was his biological daughter, what happened between them would constitute incest. A serious felony. If he hadn't known, no crime. But they needed to find him for Sophie's paternity, her medical history. Elena's stomach dropped. If they found out Marcus knew, he would be arrested. She felt sick. Not for Marcus, but for Sophie. Her father was also her grandfather. Potentially a criminal. The detectives saw her distress. None of this is your fault, Elena. You're a victim. Focus on you and Sophie. Easier said than done. The investigation took weeks. Elena tried to maintain normalcy for Sophie. She found a new, better job as an administrative coordinator for a nonprofit helping single mothers. The irony wasn't lost on her. She moved again, to a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. Used some of the money from the legal settlement, money her father, the man she used to call her father, had been forced to pay for her legal fees. Sophie started preschool. Elena started therapy, sitting once a week with Dr. Patel, a counselor specializing in trauma and family dynamics. Talking through layers of betrayal, confusion, grief. Dr. Patel helped Elena understand it was okay to be angry, to grieve the father she thought she had, to be confused and hurt about Marcus. All her feelings were valid. Slowly, painfully, Elena started putting the pieces of herself back together. She also started to see Richard Hartley differently. Yes, he'd been cruel, controlling. Tried to take Sophie. But he'd also been lied to. Raised a child that wasn't his. Betrayed by his first wife. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained some of it. The resentment. The need for control. The anger when Elena made choices he didn't approve of. Maybe he'd spent 26 years looking at her and seeing the evidence of his wife's betrayal. Maybe he'd never separated Elena the person from Elena the reminder of his humiliation. It didn't make him right, but it made him more complicated than a simple villain. Then, 8 weeks after the hearing, the detective called. Could Elena come to the station? Her heart sank. They'd found Marcus. She arranged for Rachel to watch Sophie. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she drove. The detective met her in a small interview room. They'd located Marcus in another state, working as a graphic designer. They'd interviewed him extensively. Conclusion: Marcus had not known Elena was his biological daughter. He had no idea Catherine Hartley had ever been pregnant with his child. Catherine had told him 27 years ago that she was ending their brief relationship to reconcile with her husband, and she wasn't pregnant. Marcus had moved on, never knowing he had a daughter. When he met Elena years later, he saw a stranger, a young woman he was attracted to. No connection to his past. It was a horrible, tragic coincidence. The detective verified Marcus's account through multiple sources. No evidence he'd known. No crime had been committed. Marcus wasn't a criminal. Just a man who'd unknowingly been in a relationship with his biological daughter and unknowingly gotten her pregnant. The detective paused. Then, he said Marcus wanted to speak with her. He was devastated. He wanted to take responsibility for Sophie, even though the situation was impossible to categorize. Elena asked what that meant. Legally, Maria explained later, Marcus was both Sophie's father and grandfather. No precedent. It would require legal consultation to determine his rights and responsibilities. But morally, ethically, Marcus wanted to be involved if Elena would allow it. He wanted to meet his daughter, his granddaughter. Elena sat there. Part of her wanted Marcus gone forever. To protect Sophie from this truth. But another part, the part that had spent her whole life wanting family, wanting connection, thought maybe Sophie deserved to know her father, however horrifying the circumstances. She asked if Marcus was a good person, if he seemed safe, genuine. The detective said Marcus had been cooperative, honest, deeply shaken. He'd voluntarily done DNA testing. Expressed remorse for leaving her, explaining he'd panicked, made a terrible choice, regretted it every day. From their assessment, Marcus wasn't dangerous. Just a man dealing with an unimaginable situation. Elena asked for time to think. The detective gave her Marcus's contact info. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Elena sat at her kitchen table, Marcus Chen's number on a piece of paper. She stared at those 10 digits for an hour, thinking about everything. Everything she'd lost, everything she'd survived. Then she picked up her phone. I'm Elena. I understand you want to talk. I'm willing to meet in a public place with my attorney to discuss what comes next. She hit send before she could change her mind. 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Marcus wrote that he understood, he was grateful she was willing to meet, he was so sorry for everything. Elena didn't respond. She turned off her phone, went to Sophie's room. She watched her daughter sleep. This beautiful, innocent child. Born from circumstances that defied categorization. Elena made a decision in that moment. Sophie would grow up knowing the truth. Age appropriately, carefully. But she would know. She would not grow up with lies and secrets like Elena had. She would know her family was complicated, her origins unusual, but that she was loved fiercely and completely. That was what mattered. The meeting with Marcus took place 2 weeks later, in a conference room at Maria's office. Marcus arrived on time. Elena saw him walk through the door. He looked older, more tired, gray in his dark hair, lines around his eyes. He looked at her with shame, grief, and desperate hope. They sat across from each other, Maria between them like a buffer. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus cleared his throat. He'd spent 8 weeks trying to understand. He'd met Catherine Hartley 27 years ago, during her separation from Richard. Brief affair. When Catherine reconciled, she ended things, told him no complications, no pregnancy. He believed her. He moved on. No idea she'd been pregnant, given birth to his daughter. No idea that daughter was being raised by Richard Hartley. When he met Elena years later, she was a stranger he was attracted to. Then she told him she was pregnant, and he panicked. He wasn't ready to be a father. He ran. He said he'd spent 5 years regretting that choice, wondering about her and the child he'd abandoned, feeling like a coward. Now he knew the truth. Regret had turned into something darker, more complicated. Marcus looked at Elena. "I'm sorry," he said. "The word is inadequate, but it's all I have. I'm sorry for leaving. I'm sorry for the impossible situation we're both in. I'm sorry that my daughter is also my granddaughter." He asked what she wanted. Did she want him gone? Involved? Anything at all? Elena had prepared for this. But the words felt stuck. She looked at this man who was both her father and her daughter's father, a stranger and family. She told him the truth. She didn't know what she wanted. She was still processing. Her primary concern was Sophie, making sure she grew up healthy, loved, not defined by her birth circumstances. If he wanted to be involved, he needed to be consistent, reliable, willing to work with therapists to navigate this. There would be boundaries. He wouldn't be introduced as her father right away. They'd take it slow. Elena would make the decisions for her daughter. Marcus agreed to everything. He'd do whatever Elena asked. He just wanted a chance. Maria outlined next steps, legal documentation, counseling, agreements about custody and visitation, if they reached that point. It was overwhelming, complicated, strange. But it was a starting point. When the meeting ended, Marcus stood to leave. Elena asked one more question. Why had he never tried to find out what happened to her after he left? Why hadn't he checked if she was okay? Marcus looked at her with so much shame, so much sadness, Elena almost felt sorry for him. He said he'd been a coward. Convinced himself she was better off without him. Buried his guilt under work and denial. No excuse, no justification. He had failed her. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make up for it, if she'd let him. Elena just nodded. Marcus left. Elena sat with Maria for a while longer. Maria asked if she was okay. Elena said she didn't know. Okay felt like a concept from another life. But she was surviving. And that was enough for now. Over the next months, Elena began the slow, complicated process of integrating Marcus into Sophie's life. It started with weekly phone calls. Marcus building a picture of the daughter he'd never known. After 3 months, with a family therapist's guidance, they arranged a meeting at a park. Marcus sat on a bench with a teddy bear, nervous. Sophie was shy at first, but Marcus was patient, kind. They spent an hour together. When they left, Sophie asked if the nice man could come back next week. Elena said maybe. Marcus looked like she'd given him the world. The visits became regular. Once a week, then twice. Always supervised. Carefully managed. Marcus sent child support, more than legally required. Never missed a visit or call. Slowly, carefully, he became a presence. Elena didn't tell Sophie the full truth about Marcus. She was a friend. Someone who cared. The whole truth could wait until Sophie was older, could understand and process it. Marcus agreed, grateful for any relationship. As for Richard Hartley? Elena didn't speak to him for a full year. The restraining order kept him away. Elena used that time to heal, to build a life that was hers, to stop defining herself by his expectations. At the end of the year, Richard reached out through Maria, asking to meet. Elena thought about it for a long time, talked with Dr. Patel, and finally agreed to one meeting, neutral location, Maria present. They met at a coffee shop. The same one where Elena had met Marcus years ago. The irony. Richard looked different. Smaller. Older. Uncertain. He sat across from Elena and didn't immediately speak. When he did, his voice was quiet, rough. He'd spent the year in therapy. Working through his anger, his need for control, the betrayal he felt when he learned Catherine lied. He'd spent 26 years resenting Elena for not being his, for being the evidence of his wife's affair. For existing. He'd projected all that resentment onto her, punished her for something she had no control over. He was deeply, deeply sorry. He knew she might never forgive him, that he didn't deserve it. But he wanted her to know he was trying to be better. He asked if there was any possibility of some kind of relationship. Not father and daughter, he knew he'd forfeited that right. But two people who shared history and pain, and maybe someday, understanding. Elena listened. She told him the truth. She didn't know if she could forgive him. What he'd done caused enormous harm. She'd spent years trying to earn love from someone who resented her existence. But she also told him she understood, at least partially, why he'd been the way he was. And she was willing to take things one step at a time. Maybe coffee occasionally. See if they could build something new from the ashes. Richard nodded, tears in his eyes, and thanked her. They didn't hug. Didn't make promises. But it was a start. 5 years later. Elena stood in the kitchen of a house she'd saved up to buy. A small 2-story home with a yard for Sophie. A room just for Sophie, filled with books and art. Sophie was 9 now. Bright, curious, kind. She knew the truth about her origins, in age-appropriate ways. She knew Marcus was her biological father, and also her biological grandfather. It was complicated, unusual, but it didn't define her. She knew Richard Hartley wasn't her biological grandfather, but he'd raised her mother and was trying to be better. She saw him occasionally at family dinners that were sometimes awkward, but always civil. She knew family was complicated, people made mistakes, forgiveness was hard but possible, and love came in many forms. Elena had built a life she was proud of. Not perfect, but hers. Chosen. Fought for. Earned. A job she enjoyed, friends who supported her, a thriving daughter. A therapist she still saw once a month, because healing was ongoing, not linear. She had complicated but functional relationships with both Marcus and Richard, built on honesty, boundaries, and a shared love of Sophie. She'd learned that family wasn't defined by biology or tradition, but by the people who showed up, did the work, chose to stay. Secrets always came out, eventually. Truth, no matter how painful, was better than living a lie. She was stronger than she ever believed possible. She could survive betrayal, loss, impossible revelations, and come out standing. Most importantly, Sophie would never doubt she was loved. Never question her worth. Never spend years trying to be enough for someone who couldn't see her value. Sophie would grow up knowing she was enough, exactly as she was. That was the greatest gift Elena could give her. One evening, Elena was making dinner. Sophie was doing homework. A knock at the door. Marcus. With a bag of groceries, his weekly contribution to dinner. He smiled, a little nervous as always. Asked if he could help. Elena stepped aside. He ruffled Sophie's hair, asked about her day. Sophie launched into a story about art class. Marcus listened with the attention of someone who knew how precious this opportunity was, who knew he could have lost it, who was determined never to take it for granted. Richard wasn't coming tonight, but he'd be there next week. They would all sit around this table, eat, talk. Try. Which was all any of them could do. Elena watched Marcus and Sophie. Her daughter. Laughing at his terrible jokes. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly. That felt too simple for something this complex. But contentment. A sense of peace with the life she had built from ruins. Later that night, after dinner, after Sophie was in bed, Elena sat in her living room with a cup of tea. She thought about the courtroom 5 years ago. Judge Reeves's 5 words. Wait, you seriously don't know? Those words had broken her world apart. But in breaking it, they had also freed her. From a lifetime of lies, of expectations, of trying to be someone she was never meant to be. They had been devastating and liberating, in equal measure. Elena wouldn't wish the pain of that revelation on anyone. Wouldn't choose to go through it again. But she also wouldn't undo it. Because it had led her here. To this quiet house. To this peaceful evening. To this life she had chosen for herself and her daughter. Years passed. Sophie grew into a teenager, then a young adult. Smart, compassionate, determined to make a difference. She studied psychology in college, fascinated by family dynamics and trauma, undoubtedly influenced by her own complicated history. She remained close with Elena. Called her every day. Had a warm, solid relationship with Marcus. She called him Marcus, not Dad or Grandpa, because those words didn't quite fit. But the title didn't matter as much as the relationship itself. She also maintained a relationship with Richard, who had truly tried to atone for decades of mistakes. He supported Sophie's education, attended her graduations. Treated Elena with a respect he had never shown when he thought she was his biological daughter. It was strange. Sad. And somehow, it worked. When Sophie was 23, she sat Elena down. She wanted to write a book about their family. About the complicated truth of her origins. About what it meant to be the product of an unknowing incestuous relationship, and how that shaped identity. Elena's first instinct was to say no. To protect Sophie from public scrutiny. But Sophie explained she wanted to write it not for sensationalism, but to help other people dealing with complicated family secrets, who felt alone in their unusual circumstances, who needed to know family could be built and rebuilt in ways that didn't follow traditional patterns. Elena listened. She thought about the strong, thoughtful, brave young woman her daughter had become. And she gave her blessing. Sophie wrote the book over the next 2 years, interviewing Elena, Marcus, even Richard. Weaving their stories with research about identity and resilience. The book wasn't a bestseller, but it reached the people it needed to reach. Elena received letters from readers who had discovered their own family secrets, found comfort in knowing someone else understood. Elena was 45 when she stood in a bookstore at her daughter's book launch. Watching Sophie speak to a room full of people about family, truth, and the courage it takes to define yourself on your own terms. Elena thought about the terrified 22-year-old, pregnant and rejected. The 26-year-old in the courtroom, world-shattering. The years of struggle, pain, the slow, difficult work of healing. Richard Hartley, sitting in the back row, older, frilier, but there. Because Sophie invited him. Marcus Chin, standing beside her, hair mostly gray, a fixture in their lives, still trying to make up for lost years. Her mother, Catherine, who had taken secrets to her grave. Elena wondered if Catherine had ever imagined how those secrets would eventually come to light, what destruction, and what strange rebuilding they would cause. Elena would never know. But she'd learned to make peace with not knowing, to accept that some questions don't have answers. After the launch, the family went to dinner. All of them. Together. In a way that would have seemed impossible years ago. They sat around a large table, talked and laughed. To anyone watching, they might have looked like a normal family. They weren't. Not by any traditional definition. But they were family. Bound by love, by choice, by the determination to build something good from circumstances that had been anything but. Elena's life wasn't perfect. Whose life ever is? She struggled with depression in her 30s. But she kept going. Kept showing up for Sophie. Kept doing the work in therapy. Kept building the life she wanted, one day at a time. She eventually found love again, a man named David, a teacher who understood complicated families, who loved Sophie as if she were his own. They married when Elena was 40, a small ceremony in their backyard. Sophie was maid of honor. Marcus and Richard both attended, sitting on opposite sides, but both present. Both trying. David became another piece of the puzzle that was their family. Another person who chose to show up and stay. He adopted Sophie legally when she turned 18 and asked. Not to replace Marcus or Richard, but to add another layer of love. Sophie said yes. The adoption was finalized in the same courthouse where years earlier, Elena had learned the truth about her parentage. Judge Reeves had retired by then, but Elena thought about her sometimes. The woman who had inadvertently revealed a secret that wasn't hers to tell, but that had needed to be told. Elena wondered if Judge Reeves knew what had happened after that day. That her revelation had led to pain, but also to healing. To the destruction of lies, but also to the building of truth. Elena hoped the judge knew. Hoped she understood that sometimes breaking something was the only way to rebuild it properly. Sophie graduated from college, then grad school, became a therapist. Specializing in family trauma. She opened a practice in the same city as Elena. Her waiting list grew long. She had a gift for understanding people from complicated backgrounds, for helping them make sense of identities that didn't fit neat categories. Sophie married at 28, a woman named Alex, who was kind and steady, and loved Sophie with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood what it meant to survive and thrive despite impossible circumstances. They bought a house 2 blocks away from Elena and David. When they decided to start a family, Sophie asked Elena to be in the delivery room when their first child was born. Elena held her grandson for the first time. This tiny, perfect human, the next generation of their complicated family. She wept with joy and relief in the knowledge that this child would grow up surrounded by love and truth. People who had learned the hard way that family was about choice and presence, not about biology alone. Richard Hartley lived to see his 80th birthday. Toward the end of his life, he and Elena had conversations they should have had decades earlier. He told her about his own childhood, a cruel, demanding father. About associating love with control. About falling in love with Catherine, the devastation of learning she was unfaithful. The choice to raise Elena as his own, even though every time he looked at her, he was reminded of his wife's betrayal. He knew his reasons didn't excuse his actions, but he wanted her to understand where they came from. Elena listened. She understood, at least partially. Understanding didn't erase the harm, but it added context. And context sometimes helped with forgiveness. When Richard died, Elena gave a eulogy that was honest and complicated. About a man who made terrible mistakes, but tried at the end to be better. About second chances. About how people are more than their worst moments. Marcus stood beside her at that funeral. Afterward, they talked about Richard. About the man he had been, and the man he tried to become. They agreed life was messy. People were complicated. And sometimes, the best you could hope for was that everyone was trying. Marcus lived another 15 years after Richard, active and involved in Sophie's life and her children's lives. When Marcus died at 75, Sophie spoke at his funeral. She called him her father. The first time she'd ever used that word for him publicly. She talked about the courage it took to step into a role you weren't prepared for, to love a child despite impossible circumstances, to build a relationship from scratch when the foundation was made of secrets and pain. Elena was 82 years old when she died, surrounded by 3 generations of family in the house she'd bought 40 years earlier. The house filled with love, laughter, the sound of children growing. She died peacefully. Her daughter Sophie holding one hand, her husband David holding the other. Her last words, "Thank you," spoken to the room full of people who had gathered to say goodbye to the family she had built from nothing, to the life she had fought for and won. At her funeral, Sophie stood at the podium. She told their story. The whole complicated truth of it. Because that was what her mother would have wanted. She talked about the custody battle, the courtroom revelation, the years of healing. About Marcus and Richard, the complicated roles they played. Her own journey of understanding her origins. The importance of truth. The power of forgiveness. The courage it takes to define family on your own terms. She talked about her mother's strength, her resilience, her refusal to be broken by circumstances that could have destroyed her. How Elena Hartley had taken a situation that was impossible and painful, and somehow built a good life from it. How she had loved fiercely and fought hard and never gave up on the people she cared about. The church was full of people Elena had touched. Single mothers she mentored. Friends inspired by her strength. Family members she loved. They cried. They celebrated a life that was complicated, difficult, and ultimately triumphant. Not because it was easy, but because Elena chose every single day to keep going, to keep loving, to keep building something good. This is the story of Elena Hartley. A woman who walked into a courtroom expecting to fight for custody of her daughter, and instead learned her entire life had been built on a lie. Discovered the man she called father was not her father. That the man who got her pregnant was actually her biological father. That her daughter was the product of an unknowing, incestuous relationship. This is the story of how she survived that revelation. How she built a new life from the ashes of the old one. Forged relationships with the men who had both failed and loved her. Raised a daughter who knew the truth and was not defined by it. This is a story about how secrets always come out. How the truth is both devastating and freeing. How family can be built and rebuilt in ways that defy all scripts and traditions. This is a story of resilience. Of choosing to keep going when everything in you wants to quit. Of finding love and meaning in impossible circumstances. Of a woman called an embarrassment by the man who raised her, who stood in a courtroom and watched her world shatter, and somehow, impossibly, built a life that mattered, a family that thrived, and a legacy that lives on. This is how 5 words changed everything. How "wait, you seriously don't know" became the beginning of truth, instead of the end of hope. And how sometimes, the worst moments of our lives become the foundation for the best things we ever build. It's a lot, right? A truly wild ride. I'm curious, what part of Elena's journey resonated with you the most? Have you ever had a moment where a truth completely reshaped your understanding of your own family or identity? I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments below.